Austin, Texas, 1884. The city was small then, barely more than a few thousand people, lit by gas lamps that hissed softly through the night. Horses pulled carriages down dusty streets, and at the edges of the city, wooden homes leaned against the quiet, their windows thinly curtained, their doors kept loosely latched. By day, Austin was bustling with construction, new hotels, a railway line, the promise of a growing state capital. But by night, something else stirred. Between 1884 and 1885, 7 women were attacked in their sleep. Most of them were black servant girls. All of them were taken in silence. The first killing came just after Christmas, in December of 1884. Her name was Molly Smith. She worked as a servant for a family on Pecan Street, now called 6th. Her employer, a man named Walter Hall, had gone to bed around midnight. When he woke near dawn, the back door stood ajar. Molly's bed was empty. Her body was found behind the home, laid out in the snow-dusted yard, partially undressed, a single deep wound above her ear. The police arrived quickly, though there was little they could do. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, just the dull metallic scent that lingered even after the ground was cleaned. A heavy axe was found nearby. No one claimed it. At the time, Austin had no formal homicide division. The constables, mostly Civil War veterans and drifters, relied on instinct. They suspected lovers, jealous husbands, prowlers. But nothing fit. Molly's boyfriend was jailed briefly, questioned until morning, then released when his alibi held. The murder was declared unresolved. In May of the following year, another woman was killed, Eliza Shelley. She worked for a prominent Austin family, and like Molly, she was found outside her employer's home. Her skull had been crushed. The weapon was the same, a common axe, cleaned roughly and left in the yard. People began locking their doors earlier. Dogs were chained closer to porches. The city's small newspaper, the Austin Statesman, began referring to the killer as a midnight assassin. The name stuck. Over the next several months, the pattern grew clearer. Each victim was attacked in her home, usually while she slept. The killer entered through a window or an unlatched door, struck fast, and disappeared before sunrise. There was no theft, no ransom, no sign of personal motive. In September 1885, 2 more women were killed, Rebecca Ramey's daughter, a young girl, and a cook named Mary Ramey, who was found in the yard with her head split open. By now, the city was gripped with terror. Patrols roamed the streets at night. Men gathered in small groups with rifles, standing guard outside boarding houses. Then came Christmas Eve, 1885. That night, 2 more women died, Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock. Both white, both attacked within an hour of each other in separate neighborhoods. For the first time, the city's wealthy were touched by the violence. The killings were more brutal than before. Eula's husband, James Phillips, was found wandering the street afterward, his clothes stained with blood, muttering that someone had broken in. The police arrested him before sunrise. By morning, every paper in Texas carried the story. The Statesman called it the most fearful and mysterious crime ever committed in the state. The term Servant Girl Annihilator appeared for the first time. The governor offered a $3,000 reward. Pinkerton detectives were summoned from Chicago. They found little. Witnesses claimed to see a tall man, sometimes barefoot, moving through alleys at night. Others said they heard whistling outside windows, followed by silence. Inside the jail, James Phillips sat in a cell for months, awaiting trial for his wife's murder. The evidence against him was thin, but the city needed someone to blame. Meanwhile, the killing stopped. By the spring of 1886, Austin began to return to its routine. The new Capitol building rose from the red clay. The newspapers grew quieter. The midnight assassin was fading into rumor. Then the strange reports began. A woman claimed to see a shadow moving along the rooftops near Congress Avenue. Another said a man had been watching her through her kitchen window for several nights, vanishing when she screamed. None of the stories could be confirmed. The Pinkerton agents returned north. The constables went back to chasing thieves and drunks. The cases were left in boxes in the courthouse basement. Decades later, a retired officer would recall the investigation. He said there were details the public was never told, that one of the axes had been sharpened with a file, not a grindstone. That footprints found near the Phillips house were bare, the toes pointing slightly outward. That a small piece of candle wax was found near one victim's bed, though no one in the house had used a candle that night. Rumors lingered. Some said the killer left for New Orleans. Others believed he joined the circus that passed through the city in early 1886. A few years later, the Whitechapel murders began in London. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic wondered if the Servant Girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper could have been the same man. There were similarities, the mutilations, the choice of women living on the margins, the silence of the attacks. But there was never proof. In Austin, the case faded into the dry Texas air. Streets were renamed, the wooden homes replaced by brick. The last surviving witness, a woman who had been a child during the killings, once told a reporter that her mother used to wake at the faintest sound of footsteps on the porch, years after the murders stopped. In the city's archives, the reports still exist. Handwritten pages describing women taken from their beds, one by one, their lives cut short before dawn. The words are clinical, stripped of feeling, wounds to the head, body removed from the house, property not disturbed. Nothing connects them but the pattern and the quiet certainty that whoever it was, he walked away unseen. When historians revisited the case in the 20th century, they found only fragments. The names of the victims, the incomplete police notes, the few photographs that survived. The rest have been lost in fires and floods. Even now, the story feels half-buried. The old neighborhoods where the killings took place are gone, replaced by offices and parking lots. But some of the old limestone foundations remain beneath the newer buildings. Workers digging foundations in the 1970s found iron nails, bits of cloth, and once, the rusted head of an axe. No one could say if it meant anything. At the state archives, one page from the Phillips case is marked in pencil. No further action. Suspect released. The handwriting is faint, almost rubbed away. Beneath it, another note reads, subject moved north, possibly St. Louis. There are no follow-up reports. The identity of the man who crept through the gaslit streets of Austin, entering homes in silence, was never found. The killings stopped as suddenly as they began. But sometimes, in the summer heat, when the air presses still against the windows, the city feels older than it should. Streets curve where they shouldn't. Lamplight pulls the same way it did back then. And every so often, someone walking alone at night swears they hear it, the faint scrape of something metal against wood, somewhere just out of sight. Isles of Shoals, Maine, 1873. The sea around Smuttynose Island has a sound of its own, not waves, but a long, breathing hush that moves through the fog. In March of 1873, 3 women lived alone on that rocky piece of land, half a mile from the mainland. They were sisters from Norway, Maren, Anive, and Karen Christensen. Their husbands were fishermen away that winter on a cod boat bound for Gloucester. The island had only a handful of wooden houses, a wharf, and a narrow path that wound through salt grass and stone. By early spring, the women were accustomed to the isolation. They kept a fire going, boiled potatoes and fish for supper, and listened for the bell buoys drifting somewhere in the mist. On the night of March 5, 1873, the men were expected back. Maren's husband, John Hontvet, had gone to Portsmouth with a neighbor, Louis Wagner, to sell their catch. Wagner had once worked with them, though the partnership had turned uneasy. He was in his 20s, dark-haired, quick-tempered, and said to owe money up and down the docks. That evening, as the lamps burned low in the Hontvet house, Maren and her sisters finished their meal and went to bed. The air was heavy with fog. Beyond the windows, the sea was calm, too calm, they said later, as if holding its breath. Sometime after midnight, Maren woke to a noise. The sound was faint at first, the creak of a door hinge, the crunch of gravel near the steps. She thought it might be the men returning early. She listened. Then she heard a footstep on the kitchen floor. When she called out, no one answered. In the next room, Karen stirred. She sat up, still half asleep, when a shape moved through the darkness, a man carrying something heavy in his hand. The first blow came without a word. Karen fell back against the wall. Marin screamed and ran for the parlor. The man followed. Later, she said she knew him by his walk, even before she saw his face. The way his boots dragged slightly at the heel. It was Wagner. He said nothing. He struck at her again, missed, and she fled out the door and into the cold. The fog had thickened around the island, muffling the sound of her bare feet on the stones. She ran toward the water, her nightdress catching on the rocks. Behind her, the house was silent except for the sound of breaking wood. Aniv, the youngest, tried to escape through the kitchen. Wagner caught her at the threshold. When her body was found later, she was lying face down in the snow beside the chopping block, her head struck with the blunt side of an axe. Marin hid behind a boulder at the edge of the shore. From there, she could see the house, the dim orange flicker of a lamp inside, the faint movement of a shadow crossing the window. The sea lapped against the stones just feet away. She stayed there until dawn. At first light, she climbed the rocks and made her way to the dock, rowing a small dory across the channel toward Star Island, her hands raw and bleeding from the cold. When she reached the hotel on the far shore, the keeper took her in. She couldn't speak at first, just pointed back toward the fog, where the island still floated like a dark ghost above the water. The authorities arrived later that morning. They found Karen dead in the parlor, her face unrecognizable from the blows. Aniv lay outside, her hair frozen to the ground. The axe was beside her, its handle splintered, the blade wiped clean with a rag that smelled faintly of whale oil. Inside, on the kitchen table, someone had eaten bread, cold potatoes, a half-finished cup of coffee. It took less than a day for the police to connect the name Marin had given, Louis Wagner. He'd been seen in Portsmouth the previous afternoon, asking to borrow a boat. The dockhand said he set out alone at sunset, rowing north. By dawn, he was back on the mainland, soaked and silent. He'd spent the morning eating breakfast at a tavern near the docks, paying with coins that didn't seem to belong to him. They arrested him that night. In the Portsmouth jail, Wagner denied everything. He said he'd been sleeping under the wharf, that the sea was too rough for rowing, that the women were like sisters to him. But the evidence was difficult to ignore. Wet clothing, traces of blood on his cuffs, a cut across one knuckle. When he was brought to trial in June, the courtroom was packed. Marin sat a few rows back, her hands folded in her lap. She spoke quietly, describing what she'd seen. The jurors listened in stillness. She said she had no doubt who the man was. The voice, the way he moved. It was him. Wagner's defense claimed she was confused by the darkness, that anyone could have come from the sea that night. But the jury took less than an hour to decide. He was sentenced to hang. In the months before his execution, he wrote letters insisting on his innocence. He said he'd been framed, that others had conspired against him. But there were no others. Only the silence of that island and the faint trail of oars that night, carrying him across the black water. On the morning of June 25, 1875, Louis Wagner was led to the gallows in Thomaston, Maine. The executioner noted that his last words were in German. No one recorded what they were. After his death, Smuttynose Island was abandoned for years. The fishermen stopped using its harbor, calling it cursed. The house where the murders took place stood empty until storms tore it down in the early 1900s. Today, only the foundation remains, a scatter of stones half buried in grass. Tourists who visit the Isles of Shoals sometimes climb the rocks and look out toward the spot where it once stood. On foggy mornings, the view disappears completely, the sea blending with the air until the island seems to vanish. The locals still say that when the wind is right, you can hear something across the channel. Not voices exactly, but a faint rhythm, like the creak of oarlocks moving through mist. Toronto, Canada, 1951. In the winter of 1951, Toronto was still a city of factories and fog. Streetcars hummed along Dundas and Queen, their lights flickering against the glass storefronts. The nights came early, and the air carried the smell of coal and frozen river water. At the edges of the downtown core, small boarding houses lined the side streets. Narrow two-story homes, each with a landlady, a shared kitchen, and a few quiet tenants who paid by the week. It was in one of these houses on Parliament Street that the first murder took place. On January 18th, the police were called to number 421. The landlady, Mrs. Kavanaugh, had discovered a tenant's door standing open. Inside, the air was still and warm from the radiator. On the floor lay the body of a woman named Mary Ann Wilson, a seamstress in her 40s. Her face was covered with a pillow. Her neck and shoulder had been struck several times with what appeared to be a meat cleaver. There was little blood on the floor. Most of it had been absorbed by the sheets. The weapon was gone. Detectives from 51 Division arrived within the hour. They questioned the other tenants, 2 men who worked at a nearby textile mill and a woman who said she'd heard a sound like chopping wood around midnight. The back door had been left ajar, its lock splintered from the inside. Nothing was taken except a small amount of money from Mary Ann's purse. The drawers were untouched. A cup of tea sat half-finished on the bedside table. The coroner estimated she had been dead less than 2 hours when she was found. The city papers ran the story the next morning under the headline, "Murder on Parliament Street." It was front page for a day, then moved to the back as the investigation went nowhere. There were no suspects, no motive, no pattern. 3 months later, in April, another body was found. This time it was on Girard Street, barely 10 blocks away. The victim was a young waitress named Evelyn Grant. She'd been attacked in her small basement room. The landlord discovered her when she didn't show up for work. She was lying across her bed in her night clothes, struck multiple times with a sharp, heavy blade. The angle of the wounds was identical to those found on Mary Ann Wilson. The medical examiner noted that both victims appeared to have been struck from the left side. The cuts were deep, controlled, and delivered by someone with considerable strength. The newspapers began calling him the Cleaver Killer. Police flooded the area with patrols. Night watchmen were posted at markets and butcher shops where cleavers were sold. But there was little to go on. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses. Both women had lived alone. Both had been attacked late at night, and both rooms showed signs of brief, silent struggle. In June, a third killing took place. A housemaid named Patricia Evans was found in her rooming house on Jarvis Street. She was 27. Her throat had been cut. The blade had struck so cleanly that the handle left a faint bruise where it met the skin. By now, panic was spreading quietly through the city's working districts. The police commissioner held a press conference, urging calm, insisting that the murders might not be connected. But the public didn't believe him. Women began leaving notes on their doors warning, "No room available." Husbands sleeping inside. Butchers reported stolen tools. Detective Inspector Hugh McLaren, a stoic man with 20 years on the force, was placed in charge of the case. He ordered nightly patrols in the East End, interviews with every butcher, janitor, and hotel porter in the district. In August, they finally had a lead. A cleaver was found in a trash bin behind a bakery on Queen Street. It had been wiped clean, but small traces of blood remained near the handle's groove. The manufacturer was a company called Joseph Elliott & Sons. Common, sold in nearly every hardware store in Toronto. It told them nothing. McLaren's team mapped the murders on a large board at headquarters. A triangle formed between Parliament, Jarvis, and Girard, all within walking distance of each other. In the center stood a cluster of boarding houses near Dundas Street, cheap, dimly lit, and often rented to men passing through the city. That autumn, an officer on night patrol reported seeing a man lingering behind one of those houses at 3 a.m. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and gloves. When the officer called out, the man turned and disappeared into an alley. 2 weeks later, another attack occurred. The victim, Margaret Dwyer, survived. She was 52, a widow who rented a small attic room. She said she had been asleep when she woke to find a man standing over her, his hand on her throat. She struggled, kicking at him, and he struck once with something heavy. The blow missed. She screamed, and he fled. Her description was brief: a large man, possibly in his 30s, wearing a hat pulled low. His voice, she said, was calm and polite, like someone asking for directions. Police canvassed the area, but found no one. By winter, the killing stopped. The city thawed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. McLaren was reassigned. The files were boxed and shelved under unsolved. But every few years, the case resurfaced. In 1957, A man was arrested in Montreal for the murder of a hotel maid. He had used a cleaver taken from the kitchen. The Toronto detectives traveled east to question him. His name was George Hanna, a drifter who had once lived on Dundas Street during the early 50s. He denied any connection to the Toronto murders. The physical evidence was inconclusive: different weapon, different injuries. He was convicted for the Montreal case and hanged the following year. Toronto police never charged him for the earlier killings. Over time, the details blurred. The houses where the women had lived were torn down or converted into shops. Their names faded from the papers, surviving only in yellowed police files. One of the original investigators, before his death, told a reporter that he'd always believed the killer was a man who worked with his hands. Someone used to the rhythm of cutting, a butcher, perhaps, or a kitchen worker. Someone who could swing a cleaver without hesitation. In 1964, a demolition crew working on an old building near Girard discovered a locked trunk in the basement. Inside were tools, hammers, knives, and a cleaver with a broken handle. The serial number had been filed off. The find was noted, photographed, and then lost in evidence storage. No link was ever proven. Today, there's nothing on Parliament Street to mark the site of the first killing. A parking lot covers it. Traffic moves constantly past, but a few of the older patrol officers still talk about it on long night shifts. They say that in winter, when the air is thick with snow, you can hear something behind the buildings. Not a voice, not a step, but a slow, rhythmic sound. Wakefield, West Yorkshire, 1983. The winter of 1983 settled heavily over West Yorkshire. Pinderfields Hospital on Aberford Road stood against the dark sky like a monolith, all brick and glass, its wards glowing faintly through the fog. The place never truly slept. Ambulances hummed in and out through the night, the faint whine of their engines carrying across the car park. Inside, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and wet wool coats. Visitors came and went, their footsteps echoing on linoleum floors. On the evening of January 12th, a nurse named and Kelsey began her night shift in the surgical ward. She was 28, quiet, competent, and known for her steady hands. The ward housed mostly post-op patients, older men recovering from chest surgeries, a few women in traction. Around midnight, she made her rounds, checking 4 lines and recording temperatures. The hospital was understaffed that night. Only 2 nurses were assigned to the floor. Down the corridor, a security guard named Ian Broughton made his patrols, a man in his 40s, ex-army, methodical and polite. The first sign that something was wrong came at 2:17 a.m. when a patient buzzed for assistance. He said he'd heard a sound in the corridor, like someone dragging metal along the floor. And when a look, the hallway lights flickered slightly, an old wiring issue the maintenance staff had never fixed. As she reached the nurse's station, she saw a shape moving at the far end of the hall. A man, tall, wearing a dark overcoat. His face was partly hidden under a hood. She called out, thinking he was a visitor who'd wandered in from another ward. The man stopped. Then he began to walk toward her, slow and deliberate. What happened next was later reconstructed from witness statements, because Anne herself couldn't clearly remember. The man reached her before she could move. In his hand was an axe, small, the kind used for splitting wood. The first blow caught her across the arm as she raised it. The second struck her shoulder. She fell backward, hitting the floor hard. Down the hall, a patient began shouting for help. The man turned, stepped over her, and walked quickly toward the double doors. By the time Broughton arrived from the other end of the corridor, the attacker was gone. The hospital went into lockdown. Police were called. Officers searched every exit, but whoever he was, he'd already slipped out into the fog and survived. The axe had fractured her collarbone, but missed the artery. She was conscious when paramedics arrived, able to describe the man only as tall, silent, wearing a hood. She said his eyes looked calm, not angry. The investigation began within hours. Detective from Wakefield CID examined the ward, finding faint footprints leading toward the fire stairs, damp prints, as if the man had come in from the rain. The fire door had been forced open from the outside. There were no security cameras in that section of the hospital then. By morning, the story was everywhere. Axe attack at Pinderfields ran across the front page of the Yorkshire Post. Reporters gathered outside the main entrance, their breath fogging in the cold. The hospital's administrator issued a statement, calling it an isolated incident. Staff were offered counseling, but within a week, another event occurred. At a smaller private facility 5 miles away, St. Christopher's, a night porter reported seeing a man matching the same description in a rear corridor shortly after 3 a.m. The man had been carrying something under his coat. When confronted, he said nothing, only turned and left through the side door. The porter described him as a little too calm. Police linked the two incidents, though no one had been hurt at St. Christopher's. They began checking mental health records, local parolees, and discharged psychiatric patients. Nothing matched. Then came the second attack. On February 3rd, a nurse named Julie Morton was walking to her car after a late shift at Pontefract General, about 15 miles from Wakefield. The car park was poorly lit, lined with frost. She just reached her car door when she heard footsteps behind her, slow, measured. She turned, expecting another staff member. The man was holding an axe. He swung once, striking the bonnet of her car instead of her head as she ducked. The sound echoed across the empty lot. She ran, slipping on the ice, shouting for help. By the time two porters came running from the main doors, the attacker had disappeared again into the dark. His footprints, tracked briefly in the snow, led toward the main road and vanished at the curb. The press began calling him the Hospital Axeman. Dozens of tips came in, sightings, rumors, false confessions. Police questioned night workers from every nearby facility, orderlies, ambulance drivers, boiler technicians. They even checked lumber yards for recent axe purchases. Nothing. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they began. By the end of spring, the case went cold, and Kelsey eventually returned to work, though she requested transfer to a day ward. In interviews years later, she said she never saw the man's face clearly. Only the way he moved, steady, almost practiced, like someone walking through a place they already knew. 10 years later, in 1993, new forensic reviews reopened several unsolved cases from the 80s, including Pinderfields. Detectives examined the old evidence boxes, photographs, typed reports, the plaster casts of footprints from the corridor. Moisture had warped most of the files, but one item stood out: a section of door frame from the fire stair, marked with a partial fingerprint. The print was too incomplete for comparison then. It was entered into the system again in 1994. No match. In 2007, during a database update, a technician noticed something: a partial alignment between that print and one from a burglary in Leeds, 1985. The suspect from that case, a man named Peter Latham, had disappeared before trial. He'd worked briefly as a maintenance assistant at Pinderfields in late 1982. He was never found. Police issued no public statement. The case file was reclassified as inactive, but retained for reference. Today, Pinderfields Hospital is larger, rebuilt with new wings and security systems. The old corridors are gone. The surgical ward where it happened no longer exists, demolished during the 1998 expansion. But staff who worked there in the old building still remember the story. They say that sometimes, on late shifts, motion sensors near the service stairs would trigger with no one around. A door would open slowly and close again. No one ever saw anyone enter. Los Mochis, Sinaloa, 1994. By the mid-1990s, Los Mochis was a quiet coastal city that sat at the northern edge of Sinaloa's humid farmland. Long before it became a waypoint for traffickers, it was a place of canneries, sugar mills, and the faint smell of salt on the wind. The General Hospital of Los Mochis stood a few blocks off the main avenue, a faded, low-rise building that looked the same day and night. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the ceiling fans never stopped, and the windows were always half open, letting in the sound of mopeds and barking dogs from the street below. In April 1994, the staff began talking about a man who had been lingering outside after dark. He was tall, thin, with long hair and a tattered shirt. The security guards called him El Hombre del Machete, the man with the machete, though at first it was a joke. He had been seen digging through trash bins near the rear loading dock, muttering to himself. When guards approached, he would vanish behind the trees that bordered the irrigation canal. By May, nurses started noticing strange things inside the hospital. The smell of soil near the stairwell, muddy footprints leading up to the roof, a length of plastic rope found in the storage room, knotted at both ends. Night staff grew uneasy. On the evening of June 7th, an orderly named Luis Ortega went to smoke near the ambulance bay. He saw a shape move along the wall, someone tall, barefoot, carrying a blade that glinted under the floodlight. Luis dropped his cigarette and ran inside, slamming the door. By the time security arrived, the man was gone. They found deep cuts in the paint on the metal door, 3 precise strikes from a blade. The police were called. They searched the grounds, but found nothing except a patch of disturbed soil behind the morgue fence, where someone had been sleeping. At first, people thought he was a vagrant. Then came the first killing. 2 weeks later, on June 20th, a watchman named Carlos Pena failed to report for his 2 a.m. check-in. At 3 a.m., a nurse found him lying near the back entrance. His throat had been cut, and his machete, the one he used to trim grass near the gate, was missing. The police sealed off the area. Detectives found tracks leading toward the canal. A few drops of blood, then nothing. The papers called it a robbery, but the staff didn't believe that. Pena's wallet was still in his pocket. His keys were arranged neatly beside him, like someone had placed them there. Within a week, the story spread. Nurses refused to work night shifts alone. Orderlies carried sticks. Someone said they'd seen the man standing by the irrigation ditch at dawn, holding the machete upright, staring toward the hospital. Local police increased patrols, but there were only 2 cars covering the whole district. On July 2nd, a nurse named Adriana Torres was attacked while walking home after a late shift. She lived only 5 blocks away. A neighbor heard the scream and saw a man running down the street. Long hair, bare feet, shirtless. The machete flashed once in the streetlight before he disappeared between 2 houses. Adriana survived. The blade had grazed her neck and shoulder. When she was interviewed later, she said she recognized the man's eyes. She had seen him before, months earlier, waiting outside the emergency room, whispering to himself. The police brought in several vagrants. None matched. Then something else began happening. Patients started reporting someone standing by their beds at night. When nurses arrived, the figure was gone. Security logs showed doors opened with keys that were supposed to be locked away. One night, an intern named Hector Lozano followed a faint scraping noise down the main hallway. The sound led toward the laundry chute. When he opened it, he saw something wedged inside, a length of rope looped around a steel hook. At the bottom of the chute, in the laundry room, they found a fresh set of footprints. The police returned, this time with dogs. The trail led once again toward the canal, but stopped at the waterline. In late July, after the 3rd reported sighting, investigators expanded their search beyond Los Machos. They began to suspect the man might be a drifter, someone who moved between towns, sleeping in abandoned sheds, living off scraps. They circulated sketches to hospitals across the region. That August, a farmer from El Fuerte reported finding a body in a drainage ditch. It was badly decomposed, but near it lay a rusted machete and a torn hospital wristband marked H. General Los Machos, Sala 3. The dead man was never identified. The coroner noted an old leg injury, a compound fracture that had healed badly, leaving a limp. The hospital record showed that 6 months earlier, a man with no name had been admitted with a broken leg after being hit by a bus. He had walked out of the ward 2 days later before discharge, leaving behind his crutches. His intake form listed him as male, approximate 35, no ID, no fixed address. After that discovery, the attack stopped. The police closed the file, calling it case resolved by natural cause of death. But the staff didn't believe it. They said the man who died in the ditch didn't match the one they'd seen. The hair was shorter. The face was bloated from the water. No one could be sure. Years later, the old hospital was replaced by a new building on the edge of town. The canal was filled in, paved over with concrete. Yet workers who handled the demolition said they found strange things behind the morgue wall, bones of stray dogs, fragments of rope, a single shoe, and a narrow trench dug by hand, as if someone had been trying to make a shelter. They said the soil smelled faintly of bleach. Locals still tell stories about El Hombre del Machete, that he wasn't dead, only hiding, that sometimes on hot nights you can hear the metallic scrape of his blade against the old pipes that still run under the hospital grounds. No one has seen him since. Münsterberg, Silesia, December 1924. In the winter of 1924, the town of Münsterberg was quiet and gray. Snow gathered on the cobblestones, muffling the wheels of carriages that passed under the weak glow of the street lamps. Behind shuttered windows, people spoke softly about the shortages that still lingered after the war: food, fuel, money. And in the middle of it all, on Teichstrasse at 10, stood a house that smelled faintly of vinegar and cooked onions. It belonged to a man everyone knew as Papa Denke. Karl Denke was 64 years old, small and polite, with the slow speech of someone who thought before every word. He had lived in Münsterberg his whole life. People saw him at church every Sunday, carrying his worn hat against his chest. He rented rooms to travelers, sold pickled meats at the local market, and played the organ during evening services. When he passed, children greeted him. Adults nodded. He was harmless, even kind. That changed on Christmas Eve, 1924. At around 9 in the evening, a young laborer named Vincent Olivier stumbled into the police station. His face was pale, his clothes soaked with blood. He said that Denke, the old man everyone trusted, had attacked him with an axe. The police followed him back to Teichstrasse. They found Denke sitting calmly in his kitchen, his hands folded on the table. The lamp burned low, and there was blood on the floor. When they asked him what had happened, he smiled faintly and said, "A misunderstanding." He was taken into custody. Later that night, as the constable made his rounds, Denke was found hanging from a leather belt in his cell. He had written nothing, left nothing, just a faint smell of vinegar on his clothes. That should have been the end. But when police searched his home the next morning, they found things that didn't belong in an old man's house. The first officer in the doorway described it as orderly. Everything arranged with precision. A table laid for one. A stack of notebooks tied with twine. Glass jars neatly labeled and arranged by size. When they opened the jars, the room filled with the smell of brine and meat. At first, they assumed it was pork, but the labels were strange, some marked only with initials, others with dates. And beneath the neat handwriting, there were stains that had turned the paper brown. In the cellar, the air was damp and sour. Wooden tubs lined the walls. Some were filled with bones, stripped clean. Others held lumps of fat, wrapped in cloth. In one corner stood a large enamel basin, half full of cloudy water. A single human rib floated near the rim. There were hooks on the beams overhead. Some still held rope. When the police pried opened the drawers of his workbench, they found a stack of identity papers, over 30 of them, each belonging to a man who had disappeared from the area in the past few years. Most were itinerant workers or travelers passing through. A few were beggars, known to visit the church for bread. In the margins of one notebook, written in neat Gothic script, was a list of names, dates, and weights in kilograms. It looked like an account ledger, but the goods listed were flesh, fat, skin, and bones. The total came to nearly 400 kilograms. The jars were sent for examination in Breslau. The results confirmed what the officers already feared. They contained human remains. Preserved, pickled, salted. News spread through Münsterberg before the week was over. Neighbors who had bought pickled pork from Denke swore they had eaten nothing since. The church stopped serving communion wine for a month. People said the smell of vinegar drifted from the house even after the windows were nailed shut. When police traced his past, they found almost nothing. Denke had been born in 1870 in the same district. His parents were farmers. After their deaths, he sold the property and moved into town. For decades, he lived quietly. His income came from a small market stall where he sold cured meats and leather goods, belts, straps, wallets. No one ever questioned where he got his supplies. During the war, food had been scarce. After the inflation years, meat became expensive again. In his cellar, Denke had found his own solution. The investigators tried to reconstruct his method. Victims were likely invited in under the pretense of lodging or supper. He would offer them a meal, sometimes a glass of homemade brandy. Then, once they were seated, he would strike them from behind with an axe. He worked cleanly. He drained the blood, stripped the body, boiled the bones, and preserved the flesh in jars filled with brine and vinegar. The fat he rendered into oil. The bones he burned or buried beneath the garden. Nothing was wasted. Neighbors later admitted they sometimes heard chopping sounds at night, but assumed he was preparing food for the market. One woman said she had seen him carry a heavy sack to the well behind the house on more than one occasion. The house was dismantled in January. The police burned the contents in the courtyard, all but the notebooks. They were entered into evidence, though few could read Denke's cramped script. Some of the pages had water stains and greasy fingerprints. Others listed names without weights, suggesting victims who had never even made it to the cellar. In total, the records hinted at more than 30 people. But no one knew when the first killing had occurred. The townspeople stopped using the name Denke after that. His grave was left unmarked. The number of missing persons reports in the area dropped almost immediately. By spring, Münsterberg had returned to its quiet routine. The police who had handled the case were transferred to other districts. The cellar was filled in, and the ground paved over. Years later, a rumor began circulating that a surviving ledger page had been found in a police archive, dated October 1924. It contained only one entry, written carefully in blue ink. October 31st. Ein Stück, 60 kilograms. No name, no notes, just the weight. People began calling him the Halloween Killer after that, not because of when he struck, but because of what the date suggested. That somewhere in the fog of that last October night, an old man had measured, preserved, and labeled the flesh of another human being with the same calm precision he gave to everything else. The rest of the pages have long since vanished. In Münsterberg, now Zebis, in modern Poland, no trace of the house remains. The street was renamed, the foundation buried beneath newer buildings. But in the town archive, one item still survives, a jar sealed in wax, its contents destroyed decades ago, label faded beyond reading. The curator says it sometimes leaks a faint smell of vinegar in summer. Cook County, Illinois, 1978. The snow came early that year. By late November, the neighborhoods west of Chicago were already buried in a thick gray crust, the kind that never melted completely before the next storm arrived. Houses stood dark under the sodium lamps, their roofs heavy with ice, their windows fogged from the heat inside. On Summerdale Avenue, the small ranch house at number 8213 looked ordinary enough. It was painted blue, with Christmas lights half hung along the gutter. A plastic Santa leaned against the porch railing. Inside, the furnace rattled. The walls were lined with trophies and photographs, and in the basement, the concrete floor was stained darker than the rest. John Wayne Gacy lived there alone. By day, he ran a construction business called PDM Contractors, short for painting, decorating, and maintenance. His clients described him as energetic and reliable, always on time, always in control. He hired local boys for part-time work, paid cash, sometimes fed them dinner afterward. He was also known for his charity work. He dressed as Pogo the Clown at hospitals, parades, and children's parties. He kept the costume in a suitcase under his bed, red and white makeup, a wig, oversized shoes, and a blue satin suit. People said he had a knack for making children laugh. On the night of December 11th, 1978, a teenager named Robert Piest finished his shift at the Nissen Pharmacy in Des Plaines. He told a coworker he was stepping outside to talk to a contractor about a potential job. The man's name was John Gacy. Robert never came back. His mother waited in the parking lot for hours before calling the police. She said her son was responsible, punctual, and had never run away. Detectives questioned Gacy the next day. He denied ever meeting the boy. He smiled, joked, and said he was being unfairly harassed. But when they checked his record, they found a conviction from Iowa in 1968, a charge of sexual assault against a teenage boy. He had served 18 months, then returned to Chicago to start over. The police obtained a search warrant. On December 13th, they entered the house on Somerdale Avenue. The air inside was thick and stale. They found a bottle of Valium, handcuffs, a driver's license that didn't belong to Gacy, and several items of men's jewelry. In the hallway closet, there was a smell, faint like damp soil and decay. They couldn't find the source. After hours of searching, Gacy joked with the officers, offering them coffee. They left without arresting him, but they kept him under surveillance. Over the next week, they followed him as he drove aimlessly around the city, sometimes to diners, sometimes to cemeteries, sometimes just in circles through the suburbs. He hardly slept. He drank constantly. He seemed to know he was being watched. On December 21st, one of his employees came forward and told police that Gacy had asked him to spread lime in the crawl space beneath the house. He said the smell had become unbearable. A second search warrant was issued the next day. The crawl space was narrow, no more than 3 feet high, covered with dirt. An officer crawled inside with a flashlight. He saw something sticking up from the soil, a piece of bone. He called for his supervisor, and the digging began. By midnight, they had uncovered 2 bodies. Gacy was arrested that same night while driving through the city. When confronted with the evidence, he sat quietly for a long time, then said, "There are others." Over the next several days, the ground beneath his house was opened like an archaeological dig. The smell spread through the neighborhood. Reporters gathered on the street outside as police removed body after body, each tagged with a number. In total, 29 victims were found in the crawl space. 4 more were recovered from the Des Plaines River, where Gacy said he had dumped them during the summer months when the ground was too hard to dig. He kept a detailed mental map of where each one was buried. Some were stacked together, head to chest, chest to knees, wrapped in plastic or cloth. Others were scattered in shallow graves, no more than a few feet apart. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 21. Most were local boys, runaways, hitchhikers, or young men Gacy had offered work or shelter. He described his killings in a detached tone, as if recounting chores. He said he would lure them home, show them a trick involving handcuffs, then strangle them with a rope and a piece of wood. Sometimes he would leave the bodies under the floor for days before digging a new grave. The police found dozens of personal items hidden around the house: watches, rings, wallets, keys. Some still had initials engraved on them. In the attic, they discovered a box of photographs, smiling faces, boys in overalls, 1 or 2 holding tools, one wearing a clown nose. When they asked about the costume, Gacy said he hadn't worn it in years. He claimed Pogo the Clown had nothing to do with what he'd done. But the makeup was still there in its suitcase, dry and cracked from age. The colors, white, red, and blue, had stained the lining. At the trial in 1980, the prosecution presented 118 witnesses. The defense argued insanity, citing his history of mood swings and alternate personalities. Gacy sat through most of it expressionless. Photographs of the crawl space were shown in court. The jury took less than 2 hours to find him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death 12 times, once for each charge of murder the state could prove individually. For 14 years, he remained on death row at Menard Correctional Center. He painted constantly. Most of his works were of clowns. Some were of Jesus. A few showed both smiling faces with bright blue eyes and red mouths shaped like wounds. In May 1994, at 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His last meal was a bucket of fried chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, and strawberries. When asked for final words, he said, "Kiss my ass." The bodies from the crawl space were numbered, not named, until families came forward to identify them. Some were never claimed. Their graves read only unidentified male, 1970s. The house on Somerdale Avenue was demolished in 1979. The ground beneath it was replaced with clean soil, then resold. The new owners built a brick home on the same lot, though the address number was changed. In winter, neighbors still say the air there carries a faint chemical odor, something between lime and damp concrete. The man who once entertained children as a clown who handed out laughter at parades and gifts at hospitals, left behind nothing but earth disturbed and sealed again. Nothing else ever grew there. Vienna, Austria, 1983 to 1989. The Lainz General Hospital stood on the southern edge of Vienna, surrounded by gray apartment blocks and thin strips of woodland. In winter, the trees were bare and black, and the light from the hospital windows carried far across the snow. Inside, the wards were clean, the walls pale green, the corridors long and silent. It was one of the city's largest public hospitals, known for its efficiency. The staff wore white uniforms, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. Elderly patients filled most of the beds, the forgotten ones as some of the nurses called them. Many had no visitors. They waited quietly, their bodies kept alive by habit more than hope. Among the staff, for nurses stood out. They worked the night shifts in Ward 5, the geriatric section. Their names were Maria Gruber, Irene Leidolf, Waltraud Wagner, and Stephanija Meyer. They were efficient, calm, and always willing to stay late. The doctors trusted them completely. Maria was the youngest, barely in her 20s, shy and serious. Irene was loud, quick to laugh, but known to be meticulous. Waltraud, the oldest, was reserved and devout, respected by everyone. Stephanija, the fourth, was quiet and watchful, often keeping to herself. No one paid them much attention. In March 1989, a new nurse joined the night staff. Her name was Helga Obenos. She was assigned to Ward 5 for training. On her second night, she noticed something strange. Patients who seemed stable at midnight were dead by morning. The deaths were always reported as natural. It was an old ward, heart failure, pneumonia, infections. Deaths happen often, but the pattern disturbed her. One night, around 2 in the morning, she entered a patient's room and found Waltraud leaning over the bed, whispering softly. A faint gurgling sound came from the old man's throat. When Waltraud noticed her, she smiled and said, "He's resting now." Then she straightened the sheets and walked away. By morning, the patient was dead. The chart read, "Cardiac arrest." Helga mentioned it to another nurse. The response was a shrug. "It's better this way," she said. "Less suffering." Over the next few weeks, Helga kept watch. She noticed that certain drawers in the medicine cabinet were often left slightly open, the ones holding sedatives and morphine ampoules. Once, she saw Maria carry a jug of tea to a patient and return without it. Minutes later, the monitors beeped once, then went silent. Rumors had circulated for years among the night staff that some of the older nurses believed they were helping their patients, that a certain tea or an injection could make things easier. No one said anything aloud. In May, Helga confided in her supervisor, who passed it to the administration. An internal inquiry began quietly. The hospital reviewed records for Ward 5. Between 1983 and 1989, the ward had recorded over 300 deaths, a number higher than any other in the hospital. At first, administrators blamed poor documentation. Then, they called the police. Detectives from the Vienna Homicide Division arrived without warning on a summer afternoon. They interviewed staff, examined charts, and requested the exhumation of several patients. The autopsies showed traces of morphine, diazepam, and, in some cases, water in the lungs. That last detail didn't fit the medical histories. It suggested drowning. When confronted, Maria Gruber broke first. She cried for hours before speaking. She said it had started by accident in 1983. A patient had begged for relief. Waltraud had held his hand, whispered to him, and pressed a wet cloth over his face until he stopped breathing. She called it an act of mercy. After that, the others followed. They called it Hilf dem Sterben, helping them die. Sometimes they injected overdoses of morphine or insulin. Other times they gave patients tea laced with sedatives. But the most common method, she said, was simpler. A few drops of water poured into the throat while the patient lay flat. It caused silent suffocation, indistinguishable from natural death. They called it Wasser therapy, water therapy. Between 1983 and 1989, they claimed to have helped at least 49 people die. Investigators believe the true number was over 200. In interrogation, Waltraud showed no emotion. She said they had chosen only those who were suffering, those who had no family. "We made it peaceful," she said. Irene was defiant. "Doctors let them rot," she told the detectives. "We gave them dignity." Stefanija said little. She sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. The newspapers called them the Angels of Death. The hospital shut down Ward 5 for renovation. The smell of disinfectant lingered for weeks. During the trial, the courtroom was packed. Reporters from across Europe came to hear the details. The whispered code words, the stolen syringes, the midnight visits. Witnesses described how the nurses joked about giving tea or a little water when the ward grew too crowded. Some of the victims had been fully conscious, pleading for air. Others had been asleep. In June 1991, the verdicts were announced. Waltraud Wagner received life imprisonment for multiple counts of murder. Irene Lidolf received life as well. Maria Gruber and Stefanija Meyer were sentenced to shorter terms for manslaughter, citing their cooperation and youth. After the sentencing, the press gathered outside the courthouse. A light rain began to fall. None of the nurses spoke as they were led away. Inside Lainz Hospital, the old Ward 5 was sealed. The beds were replaced, the paint redone, the walls scrubbed and bleached. But nurses who worked night shifts afterward said they could still hear water dripping near the sink long after the taps were turned off. The hospital never reopened that ward under its old number. Decades later, people still call that section the Quiet Wing. The staff who work there now avoid talking about the past. When patients die, they mark the charts carefully, sign twice, and leave the doors open for a while afterward, as if to air out the room. The corridors remain silent. The lights hum, and sometimes, in the reflection of the glass medicine cabinet, a faint shadow seems to lean forward, as if someone were still listening for the sound of breath. Buenos Aires, Argentina, 2003 to 2005. In the early 2000s, summer in Buenos Aires felt endless. Heat rose from the sidewalks, and the air smelled of diesel, sugar, and melting asphalt. Every neighborhood had its familiar sounds: the hum of buses, dogs barking on balconies, and the music of the ice cream trucks that crawled through the streets in the late afternoons. They were called heladeros, men who sold frozen cones and popsicles from brightly colored vans. Children knew them by sound. A simple jingle, cheerful and tinny, echoing between apartment buildings long after the van had passed. In the Palermo district, people began to notice one truck that didn't look quite right. Its paint was faded, the colors duller than the rest. The driver wore a clown costume. Not unusual at first, but strange in the details. The mask was too large, the smile too rigid, the fabric fraying at the edges. He called himself Pipo. Pipo's truck appeared irregularly, sometimes 2 days in a row, sometimes disappearing for weeks. Parents said he drove slowly, often stopping where no children were outside. He didn't play the music as loudly as the others. And when he did, it seemed off-key, like an old cassette warped by heat. The first missing child was a boy named Tomas, 6 years old. He vanished one afternoon in January 2004, near Plaza Serrano. His mother said she'd left him with his older sister for a few minutes while buying bread. When she returned, he was gone. The sister said she'd seen a man in a clown mask waving from an ice cream van. Tomas had walked toward it, and that was the last she saw. The police searched for days. Flyers were printed. Parks and playgrounds were combed. Witnesses described the van, white with blue stripes, a smiling clown painted on the side. But the license plate number the sister remembered didn't exist. A week later, the van reappeared 3 neighborhoods away. A security camera caught it for only a moment, turning down a side street just after midnight. The lights were off. That clip became a fixation for investigators. The image was grainy, the clown's mask barely visible in the driver's seat. But it was enough. Over the next year, 3 more children disappeared. 2 boys and 1 girl, all between 5 and 8 years old. Each case happened near a park or playground. Each had at least one witness who mentioned an ice cream van. The public panic grew slowly, muffled at first. The police avoided naming it a serial case. Parents began walking their children home from school, even in the heat. Then, in December 2004, a patrol officer in the Almagro district reported a van parked behind a supermarket late at night. He approached it, thinking it abandoned. Inside, he found melted ice cream, empty wrappers, and in the back, under a tarp, a clown costume folded neatly beside a set of surgical gloves. The registration traced back to a man named Roel Tizura, 41 years old, a former orderly at a private clinic in San Justo. He had left the job in 2002 after several complaints about inappropriate behavior around pediatric patients. The hospital never filed charges. When police went to his apartment, he wasn't there. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in weeks. The door was locked from the inside, the windows covered with newspapers. Inside, the apartment smelled of spoiled milk. The walls were lined with photos of children at birthday parties, most torn from magazines or newspapers. On a small table sat a cassette player, the same model used in ice cream vans, and a box of unlabeled tapes. One of the tapes contained nothing but 30 minutes of the ice cream truck jingle, looped over and over, growing slower each time until the notes dissolved into static. The investigation stalled. Tizera had vanished. Interpol issued a notice, but no trace appeared. In February 2005, nearly a year after the first disappearance, a fisherman near the Parana Delta found a small freezer chest washed up on shore. Inside were children's clothes and a red clown nose. Forensics confirmed traces of blood belonging to 2 of the missing children. That same week, a woman in Rosario reported a man selling ice cream from a truck painted white and blue. She said he wore no mask, but when he smiled, she noticed a faint scar at the corner of his mouth, a cut that pulled his lip upward, making the smile uneven. The local police arrived within hours, but the van was gone. The description matched the one from Buenos Aires exactly. Over the next months, sightings came from across Argentina, Córdoba, Santa Fe, even as far south as Bahia Blanca. The clown's van was seen parked at rest stops, roadside motels, abandoned lots. Always briefly, always gone by the time anyone called. Each time, investigators arrived to find faint tire marks and the same lingering smell, a mix of engine oil and spoiled cream. By mid-2005, the story had become a national obsession. Parents told their children not to approach ice cream trucks at all. Vendors were harassed, their tires slashed. Some stopped working entirely. The police finally traced a lead to a storage facility in La Plata, rented under a false name. Inside were several freezers, unplugged and empty. On the floor, someone had drawn faint chalk outlines, not of bodies but of rectangles like boxes measured precisely. The only personal item left was a broken clown mask. The edges of its mouth had been cut wider, reshaped into a grin too large for a human face. When forensics examined the mask, they found traces of DNA belonging to 3 of the missing children and Roel Tizera himself. But by then, he was gone. No confirmed sightings were reported after late 2005. The police closed the file in 2008, citing insufficient evidence for further pursuit. Officially, the case remains unsolved. The vans returned to the streets eventually, though fewer now. The jingles sound newer, cleaner. But older residents say they still remember the one that played off-key, drifting through the heat like a lullaby gone wrong. In some neighborhoods, children still whisper about the clown who never took off his mask. They say that on certain nights, when the air is thick and still, you can hear that warped jingle echo faintly between the buildings. Just one van, playing a song no one else remembers. And if you follow the sound too long, it stops before you reach the corner. Perth, Western Australia, 1963 to 1964. The suburb of Mount Hawthorn was quiet in the early 1960s, a mix of tidy post-war homes, brick fences, and lawns that smelled of eucalyptus after dusk. Families kept their doors unlocked. Neighbors called across driveways. The nights were long, still, and predictable. That changed in November 1963. Just after midnight, residents on Shakespeare Street woke to the sound of breaking glass. A woman screamed, one sharp cry, then silence. When police arrived, they found the back door of the Carmichael home forced open. Inside, 32-year-old Margaret Carmichael lay in the kitchen, her body collapsed near the pantry. An axe rested beside her, its wooden handle streaked with blood. Her husband, Alan, had been asleep in the bedroom. He told police he'd woken to a muffled thud, then the crash of dishes. When he rushed to the kitchen, he saw a man in a dark coat stepping out the back door. The figure wore a mask, smooth and pale, like a face carved from wax. Alan chased him into the yard, but the man disappeared over the fence into the darkness. The police initially suspected a burglary gone wrong. Nothing had been stolen, but the house showed signs of a search. Drawers pulled open, cupboards ransacked. They found muddy footprints leading from the back steps into the alley, then nothing. Margaret's death was ruled a homicide by blunt force trauma. The papers called it the Shakespeare Street murder. Perth wasn't used to killings like that. Then, 3 weeks later, another break-in. This time on Anzac Road, less than 2 kilometers away. The homeowner, an elderly widow named Mrs. Dyer, woke to a light flickering in the hallway. She said she saw someone standing near her door, tall, thin, wearing a white mask. When she screamed, the figure ran, knocking over a lamp. No one was hurt, but the police found the same type of footprints in the garden soil. The city grew tense. Residents installed locks and bought dogs. Children were kept inside after dark. By February 1964, 5 more incidents had been reported, all within a 10-kilometer radius, all involving a masked intruder. In 3 of those cases, an axe had been taken from the victim's own shed or tool room. The attacks followed a pattern. The homes were chosen seemingly at random, late at night, with no attempt to steal. The press gave the intruder a name, the Masked Axe Killer of Perth. Detectives from the Criminal Investigation Branch formed a task force. They canvassed hardware stores, hospitals, costume shops. They questioned men who'd recently been released from Fremantle Prison. No suspect matched the description. The police sketches showed a white mask with hollow eye sockets and a slit for the mouth, something between a mannequin face and a butcher's mask. In April, the attack stopped. For nearly 6 months, there was nothing. Then came October 3rd. At 11:45 p.m., a young couple, John and Carol Reeves, returned to their home in Subiaco after a dinner party. Carol went to the kitchen to make tea. John stepped in the yard to smoke. He heard the sound of metal scraping against wood, faint, rhythmic. He turned toward the shed, thinking it was the wind. The door was open, swaying slightly. When he moved closer, he saw an axe leaning against the wall. Then a shadow shifted behind the doorway. John shouted. The figure stepped out, tall, masked, wearing a dark coat. The man didn't run. He raised the axe once, slowly, as if testing the weight. John backed away, tripped over the garden hose, and scrambled toward the house. Carol screamed from inside. By the time neighbors came running, the intruder was gone. Carol survived, but the encounter left deep cuts across her arm and shoulder. The axe again belonged to the victims. Police increased night patrols. Checkpoints were set up along the main roads, leaving the suburbs. More than 200 men were questioned. One of the detectives, Inspector Harold Baines, told the press, "We believe the individual is local. He knows these streets well." That detail, local, unsettled people more than anything. In November, a break came from an unlikely source. A mechanic named Peter Lawton reported a strange customer at his garage on Scarborough Beach Road. The man had brought in a panel van, asking for the back windows to be covered with metal sheets for privacy. Lawton remembered the man's hands, rough, scarred, and the faint smell of kerosene on his clothes. Police traced the registration to a George Mallory, age 44, a part-time laborer who rented a small house near the coast. When officers arrived, Mallory wasn't home. They entered with a warrant. Inside the shed, they found a workbench covered in tools, a half-empty can of paint thinner, and hanging from a nail, a white plaster mask. The mask was crudely molded, but the shape matched witness descriptions almost perfectly. In a locked box under the bench were newspaper clippings of the attacks, carefully cut out and dated. 2 days later, Mallory's body was found in the dunes outside City Beach. He had taken his own life with a length of electrical cord. Forensics confirmed that his boots matched the prints found at 2 of the crime scenes. His fingerprints were on the axe from the Subiaco attack. The case was closed, but not everyone agreed. Neighbors described Mallory as quiet, polite, almost timid. He'd suffered head injuries in a car accident years earlier, and sometimes seemed confused. His employer said he'd missed several nights of work during the attacks, but others recalled seeing him at the same time across town. One of the surviving victims, Carol Reeves, told reporters she wasn't sure it was the same man. The eyes didn't look right, she said. They were smaller. The mask fit too tightly. In later years, small details didn't line up. Mallory's suicide note was vague, almost detached. He wrote, "It's better this way. I couldn't stop it." Investigators wondered if he'd meant his actions or someone else's. Then, in 1968, 4 years after the final attack, a homeowner in Mount Hawthorne reported hearing someone moving outside his kitchen window late at night. When police arrived, they found an axe leaning against the fence and a set of footprints in the damp soil. The prints matched none in the national database. The file was reopened briefly, then closed again. Perth moved on. Today, the case remains an odd fragment of the city's history, rarely spoken of, half remembered. The houses on Shakespeare Street look different now, renovated and bright. Children play in the same yards where the headlines once warned of a masked man. But every few years, someone reports seeing a figure near the old railway line, tall, wearing a pale face. Always at night, always walking alone. They say he carries something over his shoulder, swinging it lightly as he moves, the rhythm slow and even like someone keeping time. Caracas, Venezuela, 1992 to 1995. In the early 1990s, Caracas was a city of contradictions. Neon lights and traffic jams crowded the avenues, but just beyond them lay slums that seemed forgotten by time. Between the two worlds, there were narrow alleys, half-finished buildings, and empty lots where the noise of the city faded into a kind of silence. The killings began there. In 1992, municipal workers discovered a series of black garbage bags behind an abandoned warehouse in La Vega. Inside were dismembered remains, carefully wrapped, almost methodical. The cuts were clean, surgical. At first, police thought they were dealing with gang retaliation. Caracas was no stranger to violence, and the idea of organized dumping wasn't new. But what caught investigators' attention was the precision. Whoever had done a new anatomy. The autopsy report described the work as meticulous, as if done by someone trained in butchery or medicine. Over the next 6 months, more bags appeared, in alleys, near drainage canals, sometimes along the Gare River. The victims varied. Men, women, different ages, no clear link. The only consistency was the method. When journalists got hold of the details, they gave the killer a name, El Carnicero de Caracas, the Butcher of Caracas. Detective Luis Correa, one of the lead investigators, said later that what disturbed him most was how quiet it all was. There were no witnesses, no reports of screams or struggle. The killings seemed to happen in invisible spaces, the victims disappearing into the city's noise before anyone noticed. The first major clue came from a scrap of butcher's paper found inside one of the bags. Faded and oily, it bore the stamp of a small meat shop in Cadilla. Police visited the store, a dimly lit place tucked under a row of apartments. The owner, a man named Rafael Paredes, claimed he'd never seen the paper before. Still, officers noted how calm he was during questioning, polite, measured, almost detached. Paredes had worked as a butcher for 20 years, mostly in small markets. No record, no complaints. When police returned 2 weeks later for follow-up, the shop was closed. Paredes was gone. 3 days after that, another discovery. A series of trash bags stacked behind an apartment complex in El Paraiso. Inside were remains identified as belonging to 2 young men, both street vendors who'd gone missing the previous month. Their torsos showed identical patterns of incisions. Among the contents, detectives found something new, a piece of blue cloth embroidered with the words Carne de Primera, the slogan used on aprons distributed to local butchers by the Municipal Suppliers Association. Forensic analysis revealed faint traces of cleaning chemicals, the kind used to sterilize cutting surfaces. That detail changed everything. The police began checking every licensed butcher in Caracas. They interviewed more than 80 men. The press fanned rumors that the killer sold meat at open-air markets, that he mixed human flesh with beef. Panic spread quickly, but the killings stopped for almost a year. Then, in 1994, during the heavy rains of October, another body surfaced, this time mostly intact, washed up near the Petar riverbank. The victim, a woman in her late 20s, had been missing for weeks. Her body showed the same surgical precision, the same absence of chaos. In her pocket was a receipt from a grocery store less than a block from Paredes's old butcher shop. Detective Correa and his team searched the area again. Behind the closed market stalls, they found a metal door leading to a basement once used for storage. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rust and old refrigeration. Against the wall stood an industrial meat hook, and beside it, a table fitted with drainage grooves. The room was empty, except for a single newspaper clipping taped to the wall. It showed a photograph of the police chief announcing, "The butcher of Caracas still at large." Written in pen beneath it, "Not for long." The forensics team collected samples from the table and walls. Tests confirmed traces of human blood, belonging to at least 3 different individuals. Paredes remained missing. Interpol issued a regional alert, but months passed with no sign of him. Rumors surfaced that he'd fled to Colombia or was working in a meat-packing plant under another name. No proof ever surfaced. In mid-1995, a night watchman at a bus terminal in Valencia reported seeing a man matching Paredes's description sleeping inside an abandoned delivery truck. When police arrived, the man had vanished, but they found a plastic cooler in the back of the truck. Inside were blood-stained gloves and a rolled-up butcher's apron. The embroidered words were the same, Carne de Primera. That was the last confirmed evidence tied to the case. After that, the trail went cold. The task force disbanded quietly. The city moved on, as Caracas often did. Years later, retired officers spoke about how strange the case had been, how clean the scenes were, how deliberate the timing. The killer seemed to know when police were close, adjusting his routine as if he'd been listening. Some believe there had been more than one person involved, perhaps an apprentice or a partner. Others thought the killings were ritualistic, a symbolic purification disguised as butchery. No one ever proved either theory. By the late 2000s, people rarely mentioned the butcher anymore. Most of the original crime scenes had been demolished or rebuilt. The market in Quedia, where Paredes had worked, became a convenience store. The basement room was sealed and covered with tiles. Still, some locals say that on humid nights, when the air carries the smell of raw meat from the nearby markets, they remember that time. The way fear moved through the city like something ordinary, blending into daily life. And sometimes, early in the morning, the market workers claim they see a man walking past before sunrise, tall, quiet, carrying an old butcher's bag over his shoulder. They say he never speaks. He only stops to look through the shop windows, watching the knives laid out on the counters, as if searching for one that fits his hand. Then he walks on, disappearing into the crowd before the first stalls open. Napa, California, 2004. Napa Valley in autumn is still, almost too still. Rows of vineyards fade into pale fog at sunrise, and the air smells faintly of oak and crushed grapes. By late October, the harvest is over and the tourists thin out. The nights grow longer, colder, and quieter. In 2004, that quiet broke. The small neighborhood of Dorset Street sat just off of Vineyard Road north of downtown Napa. Narrow lawns, porch lights, and cul-de-sacs that ended in silence. On Halloween night, 3 women shared a small house there. Leslie Matsura, Adriana Insogna, and Laura Mianza, friends who'd moved in together the previous summer. They'd spent the evening handing out candy to trick-or-treaters, their porch lit by jack-o'-lanterns. Around 11 p.m., the last of the lights went out. Inside, they talked for a while before heading to bed. Leslie in the upstairs bedroom, Adriana across the hall, Laura in the basement apartment below. The air was mild, the windows left open. At 2 a.m., Lauren woke to the sound of movement, soft, deliberate, like someone stepping across carpet. Then came a muffled thump, followed by a short, sharp cry. She froze. The noise stopped, replaced by what she later described as heavy breathing. Moments later, footsteps came down the stairs. Lauren crawled under her bed, clutching her phone, afraid to make sound. She heard someone pause at the basement door, then retreat. The footsteps went back upstairs. The house fell silent again. When she finally emerged, the air smelled of metal and dust. She crept up the stairs, her socks sticking slightly to the floor. In the hallway, a faint trail of blood led toward the bedrooms. Leslie lay near the doorway, motionless. Adriana was still alive, struggling to breathe. She managed only a few words, "He's still here," before collapsing. Lauren ran outside barefoot and hid behind a neighbor's car, dialing 911. By the time police arrived, both women were dead. Each had been attacked with a large knife or small axe. The weapon was never found. There were no signs of forced entry. The windows were open, screens cut cleanly. Detectives from a Napa police department arrived before dawn. The house was taped off, its porch lights still glowing against the fog. The jack-o'-lanterns on the steps had burned out, leaving faint curls of smoke. The crime scene was chaotic, but strangely organized. The attacker had moved quietly, confidently. There were no random slashes, no signs of panic. Leslie had been stabbed repeatedly while asleep. Adriana appeared to have fought back. The cuts were precise, deep, a level of force suggesting anger or familiarity. Nothing was stolen. Neighbors said they'd heard nothing unusual. One man recalled seeing a car parked a few houses down around 1:30 a.m., headlights off, but he couldn't describe the model. Within days, the case consumed Napa. Reporters camped outside the street, calling it the Halloween House Murders. The town wasn't used to this kind of violence, not in a place known for vineyards and bed and breakfasts. The police interviewed dozens of people, ex-boyfriends, co-workers, neighbors. They searched local hardware stores for recent axe purchases. They found nothing. Then they looked closer at the house itself. In the basement, forensic teams discovered cigarette butts in a planter outside Lauren's window. The brand Camel Lights wasn't used by any of the women. Whoever had been smoking there had likely watched the house for hours before the attack. DNA from the cigarettes matched a partial profile found on one of the window screens. It wasn't in the database. Detectives suspected someone close to the victims. The attack had been too deliberate, too personal. Leslie, 26, was a former beauty queen from South Carolina who'd moved to California for a job with a winery. Adriana, 26, worked as an engineer for the city. Both were well-liked, social, and cautious. Lauren told police she couldn't think of anyone who might want to hurt them. For months, the investigation stalled. Tips came in from all over the state, none credible. Halloween came and went again, the house on Dorset Street still sealed, its curtains drawn behind police tape. Then, almost a year later, in September 2005, a forensic lab in Richmond made a breakthrough. The DNA from the cigarette butts and window matched a new submission. A man named Eric Koppel, 26, an acquaintance of Adriana's through her fiancé. Koppel was a construction estimator, quiet, meticulous, known for being polite but withdrawn. He had attended Adriana's wedding the previous year and been photographed with her and Leslie at a party weeks before the murders. When police brought him in for questioning, he confessed almost immediately. He said he'd been drinking heavily the night of the attack. He parked near the house, smoked several cigarettes, and climbed through the window using a knife to cut the screen. He claimed he didn't plan to kill anyone, that he lost control. But the details didn't fit that explanation. The movements, the precision, the calm escape, they spoke of preparation, not impulse. Koppel's motive was never fully clear. Some believed jealousy played a role. Others pointed to underlying mental illness. He refused to elaborate during trial. In 2007, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. After the sentencing, the case faded from the news. The house was sold quietly, repainted, the yard replanted. The new owners declined interviews. Still, locals remembered. On Halloween nights in Napa, Porch lights stayed off more often than before. Parents accompanied their children down every street. The house on Dorset Street sits at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The vines around it have grown taller, casting long shadows across the windows after dark. Sometimes, neighbors say they see faint light flickering inside, like someone moving with a flashlight. But when they look again, it's gone. The street is silent, the air heavy with the scent of wet leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, and the sound echoes against the hills, then fades, leaving only the hum of the valley, steady and low. For those who remember, that silence feels the same as it did that night in 2004. The moment after the noise stopped, when the city slept and the fog rolled in over the vineyards, covering everything in white. Papakura, Auckland, 1941. In the winter of 1941, the town of Papakura was quiet. Rows of timber cottages, a single main street lined with shops, and the distant hum of trains heading north toward Auckland. Life there followed a rhythm unchanged for years. Farmers rising before dawn, children walking to the small local school, the slow, gray drizzle that settled over the fields. On the night of June 19th, the rain came early and heavy, drumming on corrugated roofs and swelling the roadside ditches. Inside a modest weatherboard house on Great South Road, the Wackelin family had turned in for the night. Harold Wackelin, 45, was a railway worker, quiet, dependable, rarely seen after dark. His wife, Edith, 41, managed the home and cared for their two children, Doris, 14, and Ronald, 11. Neighbors remembered the family as polite and ordinary. Nothing about them seemed remarkable. Shortly after 1 a.m., a milkman cycling his route noticed something unusual. The Wackelin's gate was swinging open, the front door ajar. He dismounted, called out once, then again. No answer. He approached the porch. The door creaked as he pushed it wider, revealing the faint smell of smoke and something else. Iron, damp, and sweet. He stepped inside. The first body was just beyond the doorway, Edith lying partly across the hall carpet. A heavy blow had crushed her skull. Behind her, the bedroom door was splintered, hanging off one hinge. The milkman stumbled backward, dropped his lantern, and fled to the next house to raise the alarm. When constables from the Papakura station arrived 15 minutes later, the rain had nearly stopped. Their boots sank into the mud as they entered, flashlights cutting through the dark. Inside, they found the rest of the family. Harold lay in bed, still in his work trousers, head caved in by what appeared to be an axe. Doris was found beside the window, hands raised as if to shield herself. Ronald was discovered under his blanket, small and still. The house showed no sign of forced entry. The back door was unlatched from the inside. The kitchen clock had stopped at 12:47. An axe was missing from the shed. Detective Inspector James Cameron from Auckland was assigned to the case. He arrived before dawn, walking through rooms still wet from rain blowing in through broken panes. The floorboards were slick. In the front room, a half-smoked pipe rested on the mantel beside a single boot print, larger than Harold's, deeply pressed into the wood. Neighbors gathered in silence outside the gate, their breath rising in the cold. Word spread fast. Papakura hadn't seen a murder in years, not like this. Newspapers from Auckland sent reporters within hours, their headlines the next morning screaming family of 4 slain in bed. Detectives searched the property inch by inch. The shed's axe handle was found later that day, buried under wet soil behind the chicken coop. The blade had been wiped clean. No valuables were missing. The telephone line had been cut. The first theory was that of a drifter, someone traveling by train, sleeping rough near the rail line, who'd slipped into town during the storm. Several witnesses mentioned seeing a man walking south along Great South Road around midnight, carrying what looked like a sack. Police detained 2 itinerant workers the next day. Both were questioned, released, and cleared. Then attention turned closer to home. Harold Wackelin was known to keep cash in the house, hidden in a biscuit tin under the bed. The tin was still there, untouched, but someone had recently borrowed tools from him. A neighbor named Albert Housen, 27, a mechanic who lived 3 doors down. Housen was unmarried, known to drink, and had been seen arguing with Harold a week earlier over a small debt. When police visited his house, he was asleep, his boots still damp. In the corner of his shed, they found an oilcloth bundle. Inside it, a shirt and trousers spattered with blood. Howson denied everything. He said the stains were from a sheep he'd butchered 2 nights before. But investigators noticed a long scratch on his wrist and small cuts along his fingers. The blood tested positive for human origin. Under interrogation, Howson wavered. He admitted visiting the Wackelins earlier that night, claiming Harold had refused to lend him money. He said he left around 9 p.m. and went home to drink. When confronted with the timeline, the clock stopped at 12:47. The footprints, the missing axe, he fell silent. Cameron pressed him for hours. Finally, in a low voice, Howson said, "I went there to talk. That's all." They started shouting. "I didn't mean to." He stopped there. Later, a railway watchman came forward. He'd seen a man matching Howson's description crossing the tracks toward Papakura at 11:30 p.m., carrying what looked like an axe handle. That was enough. Howson was charged with 4 counts of murder. His trial began in Auckland in October 1941, drawing huge crowds. Reporters described him as pale, expressionless, eyes downcast. The prosecution painted him as a resentful neighbor driven by envy and drink. The defense argued insanity, claiming he'd been hearing voices, that he'd seen lights moving in the Wackelins' windows, and thought they were signaling him. The jury took only 3 hours. On October 24th, Albert Howson was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed at Mount Eden Prison the following February. Afterward, the Wackelin house stood empty for months. The council eventually sold it to a family from Hamilton who tore down the back wall and built new rooms. Still, the townspeople avoided the place. Children walking to school would cross the street before passing it, whispering that lights could be seen flickering inside after rain. Decades later, when the house was demolished, workers found something under the floorboards, a single fragment of timber with a deep, crescent-shaped cut, soaked through with old, blackened stains. No one kept it. Papakura grew, swallowed by the sprawl of Auckland, but the story lingered. The police file, faded and thin, sits today in the Auckland archives, labeled simply, Wackelin Family, 1941, Homicide Axe. The edges of the pages are still smudged, faintly dark, as though the rain never dried completely that night. Prague, Czech Republic, 2013. It began with photographs. In early autumn of 2013, several residents of Prague's Žižkov district discovered printed Polaroids slipped under their doors. The images showed street corners, stairwells, and parked cars. Ordinary places, but each one had a single figure standing somewhere in the background. A man in a clown mask. He never looked at the camera directly. In one picture, he stood at the far end of an alley, head tilted. In another, on the opposite side of a tram stop, blurred slightly, as if moving. Each photograph was taken at night, lit only by sodium streetlights that turned everything the color of dust. At first, people thought it was an art project. Žižkov was full of that sort of thing. Performance pieces, student films, guerrilla installations. Someone stapled a few of the Polaroids to a light post with a note, "Nice costume, whoever you are." 2 days later, that same light post was found wrapped in red cloth, its base smeared with something that looked like paint. It wasn't paint. The first police report came from a 27-year-old student named Lenka Krylova. She lived alone in a 4th-floor flat near the Alseny Cemetery. One night in October, she was woken by a faint sound outside her window, 3 slow taps on the glass. When she drew back the curtain, she saw a shape on the sidewalk below. A man stood under the streetlight, dressed in a dark overcoat, a white clown mask with red-painted lips pulled over his face. He didn't move. He only looked up at her, hands hanging loosely at his sides. Lenka called the police, but by the time a patrol car arrived, he was gone. The officers searched the street, found nothing but wet footprints leading toward the cemetery gate. They told her it was likely a prank. 2 weeks later, another woman reported finding a Polaroid on her windshield showing her own apartment building, taken from across the street. Soon, the pattern spread across the district. dozens of unexplained sightings, all describing the same figure. Always at night, always watching. He never spoke, never approached anyone directly. But sometimes he left things behind. A child's red balloon tied to a doorknob. A broken toy hand mirror placed carefully on a step. A half-empty bottle of perfume sitting on a window ledge. The locals began calling him Clown Zizkova, the clown of Zizkov. By November, fear had turned to obsession. Amateur detectives created online threads tracking sightings. Maps appeared showing where the Polaroids had been found. One theory suggested it was a marketing stunt for a horror film. Another claimed he was a homeless man using the mask to frighten people away from his sleeping spots. But then came the night of November 22nd. Around 11:45 p.m., a tram driver called police after spotting a body lying near the tunnel by Husinecka station. The victim was identified as Martin Blaha, 32, a local bartender. He had been struck multiple times with a blunt object. No wallet, no phone, no sign of robbery. In his pocket was a Polaroid photograph showing the exact location where his body was found. In the photo's corner, a small red fingerprint. Detectives from the Prague Police Homicide Division took over. They examined hundreds of online reports, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed CCTV footage from the area. One image, captured at 11:23 p.m. that night, showed a tall man in a dark coat walking down Husinecka Street. His face was covered by a white mask with red markings. In his left hand, he appeared to be carrying a wooden mallet or baton. The footage was too grainy to identify him. Within days, more photographs appeared, mailed directly to police headquarters. The envelope contained 5 Polaroids. The tram tunnel where Blaha died. The inside of the stairwell marked Vinohrady, 23. A close-up of a hand gripping the mask's edge. A reflection of someone taking a photo in a glass door. And the last, a picture of a detective's car parked outside the station. All stamped with the same red fingerprint. Fear tightened its grip on Zizkov. Bars closed early. Street lights near the cemetery were left burning all night. Parents refused to let their children walk alone to school. The newspapers began calling him the Prague Clown Stalker, claiming he moved like a ghost, leaving no trace except photographs. Then, in December, a break came. A surveillance camera at a 24-hour grocery captured the masked man entering the store at 2:13 a.m. He bought a disposable lighter and a pack of cigarettes, paid in cash, and left. The clerk described him as tall, speaking Czech with a faint foreign accent, maybe Polish or Slovak. Police circulated the footage. 2 witnesses came forward, identifying the man as Tomáš Havel, 35, a former street performer who'd once worked with a traveling carnival that toured the Czech Republic in the early 2000s. Havel had gone missing in 2011 after being evicted from a squat near Zizkov Hill. When officers searched the abandoned building, they found traces of recent occupation, a mattress, several burnt Polaroids, and a box filled with clown masks. Each mask had a number written on the inside in black marker, 1 through 17. The 18th was missing. In late January 2014, another call came in. A resident on Lupakova Street reported hearing footsteps on her roof just after midnight. When police arrived, they found no one, but on the skylight above her bedroom, there was a single Polaroid taped to the glass. It showed the interior of her apartment, taken from above. There were no signs of forced entry. 2 days later, the body of Tomáš Havel was discovered in the Vltava River, near the Libin Bridge. His hands were bound, his coat pockets filled with stones. A white clown mask was tied to the back of his head with red cord. The coroner estimated he had been dead for at least a week. Cause of death: drowning. No fingerprints were found on the mask. After that, the sightings stopped. No more Polaroids appeared. No more late-night tapping on windows. The city slowly exhaled. Police eventually ruled Havel's death a suicide, though the file contained several inconsistencies. The bindings were tied too tightly for self-restraint, and a shoe print found near the riverbank didn't match his size. The case was left open. Years later, new tenants moved into Lenka Krylovia's old building. The flats had been renovated, the hallways painted white, the mail slots replaced. But during the first week of February 2019, a resident on the third floor reported finding an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed the view from her balcony, the street below, the tram lines curving toward Husinecke station. And in the corner, just visible in the shadows, a figure in a white mask standing beneath a flickering lamp. Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 1962. In the summer of 1962, Rio de Janeiro was preparing for Carnival. The streets shimmered with color. Paper banners strung between light poles, brass bands rehearsing in courtyards, the smell of fried cassava rising through the heat. At night, the city pulsed with samba and laughter, masks and feathers, strangers moving shoulder to shoulder through the narrow streets of Lapa. Amid the celebration, the first body was found. It was early morning on February 9th, near the railway tracks of Estácio Station. A street cleaner discovered a man's torso wrapped in a sequin cape, the kind worn in parade processions. The head and limbs were missing. The sequins were sticky with blood. The newspapers called it O Misterio do Estácio, the mystery of Estácio. Police cordoned off the area, collecting scraps of fabric and a broken carnival mask half buried in the dirt. The coroner determined the man had been dismembered with an extremely sharp blade, possibly a butcher's cleaver. No identification was found. 3 days later, another discovery, a woman's arm floating in the Guanabara Bay, wrapped in blue silk. And then, during Carnival weekend itself, a child stumbled upon a paper box near Cinelandia Square. Inside was a human hand, painted gold. The press began to call him O Cugueiro do Carnival, the Carnival Butcher. Detective Eduardo Viana, 39, was assigned to the case. He had spent 15 years with the Polícia Civil, known for his composure and his distrust of spectacle. He didn't attend Carnival, didn't dance, didn't drink. To him, the city during those days became a mask itself, anonymity disguised as joy. The first task was to identify the victims. The torso found near Estácio was later matched to a missing performer named Jorge Almeida, a tailor who worked on costume for the Unidos de Tijuca Samba School. Almeida had disappeared 2 nights before Carnival. His neighbors recalled a man visiting him that evening, tall, wearing a white coat, speaking softly in a northeastern accent. The second victim, the woman whose arm washed up in the bay, was identified as Lucia Ribeiro, a seamstress who'd also worked on parade outfits. Both victims had connections to the same workshop on Rua Haddock Lobo. Viana visited the building. The owner, an elderly costume maker named Senor Paulo, said that many of his staff had left for the carnival parades. When shown photographs of the crime scene, he shook his head. Monstruoso, he muttered. Then he mentioned something odd, a man who had rented the storeroom behind his shop 2 months earlier, paying in cash, no questions asked. He said his name was Miguel. He claimed to be a butcher from Recife, new to the city, looking for a place to store meat for a food stall he planned to open during Carnival. The storeroom was still locked when Viana arrived. Inside, the smell was overwhelming, not of decay, but of disinfectant. The concrete floor was stained dark, the sink rusted red. On a wooden table lay several knives, each sharpened to a fine edge. In the corner was a large brass basin, half filled with water and fragments of sequined fabric. No meat. On the wall hung a cracked mirror and a photograph tacked beside it, a faded portrait of a young woman holding a child. On the back of the photo, a single word written in pencil, Dulce. Fingerprints taken from the knives matched no records. As Carnival drew to a close, fear settled over the city like humidity. Beneath the rhythm of drums and fireworks, a sense of unease threaded through the crowds. Vendors whispered of a man with a butcher's apron seen wandering near the parades, offering free food from a cart that no one ever found again. On the night of February 18th, police received an anonymous call. The voice was male, trembling. He claimed to have seen the carnival butcher entering an abandoned warehouse near the port, carrying a large sack. Viana and 2 officers went there before dawn. They found the sack, empty, damp, lying beside a wooden crate. Inside the crate were human remains wrapped in carnival flags. Among them, a head. It was Jorge Almeida. The scalp had been carefully washed, the eyes closed. A painted smile had been drawn across the mouth in red grease paint. Vienna stepped back, the sound of waves echoing through the hollow building. He noticed a single footprint near the crate, boot tread, narrow heel, size 42. It led toward the back door and disappeared into the mud. Within hours, the docks were sealed. Ships were searched. Passengers questioned. But no one named Miguel appeared on any passenger lists. Detectives circulated sketches across Rio and neighboring cities. The description varied slightly from witness to witness. Tall, quiet, dark hair, accent from Pernambuco or Bahia. Always polite, always smiling. By March, no new bodies appeared. The story slipped into rumor. Then, in June, hundreds of kilometers north in Recife, local police investigating a fire in an old slaughterhouse found something buried behind the building, a wooden trunk. Inside were human bones, dozens of them cleaned and wrapped in paper labeled with dates from years earlier. Some bore cut marks identical to those found on the carnival victims. Among the debris, they also discovered a blood-stained white coat embroidered with the name Miguel A. Santos. The owner of the slaughterhouse said it had been rented to a man by that name in 1960, who claimed to be a meat supplier. He disappeared the following year. Vienna traveled to Recife personally. He visited the burnt structure, the nearby taverns, the small boarding houses where the man had stayed. In one of them, the keeper remembered him, educado, always with his suitcase, always buying pigs' heads from the market. In a drawer behind the counter, she still kept a piece of paper he'd left behind when he vanished. It was a receipt for butcher's knives, dated December 1961, signed simply, M. Santos. Nothing more. No photograph, no confirmed identity. Some said he had fled to Argentina. Others whispered he'd returned to Rio during Carnival every year, hiding among the massed crowds, feeding his obsession for color, music, and blood. Police never confirmed it. By 1965, the Carnival Butcher had faded into urban legend. Yet the case file remained open. The final page contained a list of unsolved disappearances from the 1950s and 60s. Costume makers, performers, and drifters, all from cities that hosted carnival parades. At the bottom of that list was a note in Vienna's handwriting. Pattern continues. Timing matches carnival schedule. Identity unconfirmed. Possibly same offender traveling annually. In 1978, long after Vienna retired, a janitor cleaning an abandoned warehouse in Rio's Gamboa district discovered a locked iron cabinet. Inside were 6 mannequin torsos dressed in decaying costumes. One wore a butcher's apron streaked brown with age. Pinned to the collar was a yellowed scrap of newspaper. Carnival returns. City dances again. No prints. No trace of the man who placed them there. The cabinet was removed and quietly destroyed. But in certain neighborhoods of Rio, older residents still remember that year. The sound of drums and the strange, heavy silence that came afterward when the parades ended and the city's lights went out. And they say that, sometimes, during Carnival Week, a figure can be seen moving through the crowds, a tall man in a white coat, smiling beneath the heat, carrying a butcher's sack that sways gently with each step. In the late 1990s, Caracas was a city unraveling under its own weight. The streets pulsed with noise and motion, horns, protests, stray dogs weaving through traffic. But beneath that chaos, another rhythm was quietly taking hold. It was slower, colder, and centered in the industrial outskirts, where the smell of diesel and rain mixed with something that didn't belong. Police reports from the time describe it clinically, a series of dismembered bodies found over a span of 14 months between 1996 and 1998. The press called him El Carnicero de Caracas, the Caracas Butcher. The name caught on long before there was proof that a single person was behind it. At first, the police didn't even believe the killings were connected. The victims were scattered, men and women, mostly from the poorer neighborhoods that ringed the city like a rusted belt. What united them wasn't their lives, but the way their deaths looked. The first discovery came after a storm. A sanitation worker found a black garbage bag washed up against a drain near Avenida Lacuna. Inside were human arms, stripped clean past the elbows, as if someone had practiced butchering. No head, no torso, just limbs. The coroner noted the precision of the cuts. Whoever did it knew anatomy. That was the first body part they found, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the next months, the city's trash collectors became unwilling witnesses. One by one, they turned up sealed bags on street corners and dumpsters, sometimes placed carefully beneath bridges. Inside were more remains, torsos, legs, partial skulls, all drained of blood. At first, it seemed random. But when investigators laid the recovered remains out on long stainless steel tables in the morgue, a pattern began to show. The same type of knife, the same level of dissection, the same thick plastic bags. By spring of 1997, the newspapers were running daily updates. Grainy photos of police cordons, morgue vans, grieving families. The fear spread faster than facts. Some said the killer was a doctor. Others, a slaughterhouse worker. Rumors turned to urban legend. Parents warning their children not to wander, taxi drivers refusing fares into the hills after dark. And through all of it, the police struggled. Caracas had one of the highest homicide rates in South America. The idea that one murderer was behind a dozen bodies almost seemed trivial compared to the daily numbers. But this case was different. It wasn't the body count that terrified people. It was the order. There was something almost clinical in the killings, a ritual precision that didn't match the chaos of the streets. Detectives noted that the remains were washed, wrapped, and deposited in areas known for heavy foot traffic, like someone wanted them to be found, but not recognized. One piece of evidence changed the course of the investigation. In August 1997, a head was discovered inside a refrigerator box behind a closed butcher shop in El Cementerio district. It was that of a man in his 40s, missing for 3 days. When the coroner examined the cuts around the neck, he said it looked like the work of someone who'd slaughtered livestock before. The police raided the shop that same night. The owner, a quiet man named Alejandro Ruiz, had been working there for 20 years. He was known to be polite, almost withdrawn, but his co-workers said he'd grown strange recently, locking up early, muttering to himself, taking long walks after closing. When questioned, Ruiz denied everything. He said the box wasn't his. But in the back room of the shop, beneath a loose floorboard, they found knives wrapped in cloth and a stained butcher's apron that had been scrubbed until the fabric thinned. Blood testing was still primitive then, but traces of human tissue were detected on one of the blades. They took him in. During interrogation, Ruiz barely spoke. The officers described his expression as empty, like a man waiting for something that would never come. When they pressed him about the victims, he asked only one question: "Did you find the rest?" Then he went silent. The newspapers declare the case solved. Caracas butcher captured. People exhaled. For a few weeks, it seemed finished. Ruiz was held in a psychiatric wing of a local prison while awaiting trial. Then, on the second week of November, 2 more dismembered bodies appeared. Same method, same bags, same precision. It wasn't Ruiz. He'd been in custody the entire time. That's when investigators realized there might be more than one person involved. Ruiz had once apprenticed at a meat processing plant outside the city. An old facility shut down in the early 1990s. Police searched the grounds and found nothing, except for a network of disused cold storage rooms still intact beneath the concrete. The smell of rot lingered there, faint but unmistakable. According to the official report, forensic teams recovered traces of blood deep in the grout lines of the floor. DNA testing didn't exist locally then, so they couldn't identify it, but the coroner said the pattern suggested repeated washing over months, maybe years. No remains were found, but something had happened there. Something careful. In December 1997, Ruiz was transferred to a mental institution for evaluation. He never stood trial. The doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, though no hallucinations or delusions were recorded. He refused to talk about the killings. All he said, when asked why he became a butcher, was that it was an honest trade. The killings stopped for nearly a year. Then, in 1999, 2 partial torsos were found again near the Gare River. The cuts were cruder this time, less practiced, as though someone was imitating the method rather than continuing it. By then, the case had gone cold. The files were shelved under unsolved serial homicides, and the press had long moved on to political stories. Today, the original police photos are kept in the archives of the Caracas Metropolitan Police. Most are water-damaged, the ink fading. The few that remain legible show the same scene repeated again and again. Black bags, stainless tables, a small white tag tied to each limb. Locals who still remember that time sometimes tell stories about Ruiz. Some say he died in the asylum in 2001. Others insist they've seen him wandering the old market streets near the slaughterhouse, muttering to himself, carrying a small parcel wrapped in butcher's paper. No one ever confirmed who the real Caracas butcher was. And yet, in 2012, a group of construction workers renovating the old meat plant uncovered a drain clogged with what looked like hardened fat. When they cut it open, pieces of human bone washed out with the runoff, smooth, bleached, and small enough to fit in a child's palm. They closed the site by nightfall. The next morning, it was sealed under new concrete. No investigation followed. The police files remain classified, and Ruiz's death certificate has never been located. Somewhere under that building, beneath the concrete and rust, the old drain system still runs toward the river. Locals say that on certain hot nights, when the air smells faintly of iron, you can hear the slow trickle of water beneath the floor, like something still being washed clean. It began in Moscow's northwestern districts, an area of faded apartment blocks, cold light, and long, empty courtyards that caught the sound of footsteps in winter. Between 2002 and 2006, residents started finding bodies near the rail lines that cut through those neighborhoods. At first, no one noticed the pattern. The city was large, its police overworked, its winters long. Deaths came and went quietly. But the faces, when there were faces left to recognize, had something in common. They were covered. The first was found behind a kiosk near Reknoy Vauxhall. A man in his 50s, local, an electrician. He'd been stabbed repeatedly, but his face had been wrapped in a cheap latex mask, a smiling one, the kind sold at outdoor markets during the New Year festivals. The police treated it as an isolated act of cruelty. They filed it away. A month later, a woman was found 2 districts away, in a small park half buried under snow. She had been beaten, then strangled. The same type of mask covered her face, but this one was different. Painted like a clown, its mouth frozen in an exaggerated grin. A cigarette, but lay beside her, perfectly balanced on the ice. By spring of 2003, there were 4 victims. Each death occurred within walking distance of a metro station. Each was killed at night. The bodies found the next morning by commuters or sanitation workers. No witnesses. No footprints, except those washed away by snow or rain. The tabloids called the Maska the Mask. At first, the killings drew little national attention. Moscow's crime rate was still high in those years, and the early 2000s were a time of transition. New money, new buildings, but also a strange sense of anonymity. The police followed leads that went nowhere. One detective described the feeling as chasing a shadow through fog. The investigation changed direction after the 5th victim. He was a young man, 23, found near a playground on a quiet residential street. This time, there was something different. The mask wasn't plastic. It was leather, homemade. The stitching ran unevenly across the seams, as if hand-done. Inside, forensic technicians found a faint residue of glue mixed with hair fibers that didn't belong to the victim. A task force was formed under Major Antonov, a veteran investigator known for his patience. He ordered every mask vendor in Moscow questioned. Thousands of records were checked. Imports from China, factory runs, local artisans. Nothing matched. Whoever made them had done it privately. Then, in late 2004, an elderly woman came forward. She ran a small repair shop on the outskirts of the city, near Tichino. She told police that a man had visited her several times between 2002 and 2003, asking her to mend torn gloves and occasionally strange costume pieces. When asked to describe him, She hesitated. She remembered his hands more than his face. They were covered in scars, she said. She showed them the drawer where she kept old orders. Among them was a slip of paper, faded, but with the name M. Kalinev. The police ran it through their database and found a partial match. Mikhail Konstantinovich Lunev, age 41, former costume designer for a small theater troupe that had closed in 1999. No criminal record. Lived alone in a Khrushchevka block near the Sokol metro. When officers arrived at his apartment, no one answered. The neighbors said he was quiet, polite, always carrying fabric rolls. He hadn't been seen for several days. They forced entry. The apartment was clean. Too clean. The kind of sterile order that made the detectives uneasy. In the main room, the wallpaper was stripped to the plaster. On the walls hung masks, dozens of them, arranged in careful rows. Human faces cast in plaster, others made from latex, some painted, some plain. Each bore a number written in pencil beneath it. There were 19 in total. They found no human remains, no blood, but in the corner stood an old trunk. Inside were sketches, pencil drawings of faces labeled only with dates. The earliest was 2002. The most recent, 3 weeks before the raid. The media learned of it within hours. The story ran on national television. Moscow masked man suspect found. But Lunev was nowhere to be found. His passport was missing, and his bank account had been closed months earlier. A single Metro card was left on the kitchen counter, still loaded with credit. Over the next 2 years, the murder stopped. Police believed he'd either fled or taken his own life. The masks were locked away in evidence storage, tagged, and forgotten. Until 2008. That year, a construction crew demolishing a warehouse near Koroshevo discovered a hidden room behind a bricked-over doorway. Inside, they found clothing, bones, and fragments of rubber masks half melted from heat. It looked like someone had tried to burn everything. Among the debris was a metal ID badge, corroded but legible. It read MKL. DNA testing identified the remains as belonging to 2 individuals. One was an unknown male. The other matched the profile of one of the early victims from 2003. The investigators could never explain how that was possible. After the warehouse find, rumors spread. Some claimed that Lunev hadn't worked alone, that the killings were part of something broader. A performance art circle, a clandestine theater group obsessed with identity and death. But the files give no indication of that. What they do mention, briefly, is a single note found at the scene. It was written in neat Cyrillic script on the back of a costume invoice. When they were the face, they stopped being afraid. The handwriting didn't match any known sample from Lunev. The Moscow police closed the case in 2009, citing insufficient evidence. But unofficially, detectives kept a watch on similar incidents. Every few years, a new case appeared. A woman in St. Petersburg, a homeless man in Yaroslavl, each found with a mask over the face. Always different materials, but the same precision. No suspect has ever been confirmed. The photos from the apartment still exist in the archives, filed under Objects 1 to 19. They were never displayed publicly. One officer, years later, described them from memory. They looked almost alive. You'd swear the eyes were following you. In 2017, an anonymous parcel was delivered to a Moscow radio station. Inside was a single latex mask, pale and expressionless, folded carefully in wax paper. No note. The return address was a vacant building that had once housed the old theater troupe, where Lunev worked. Police collected it. The file was reopened for 6 months. Nothing came of it. To this day, there's no record of Lunev's body ever being found, no verified sightings, no confession. His apartment block has since been renovated, the walls repainted, the neighbors replaced. But some of the older residents still say that, late at night, they sometimes hear faint footsteps in the hallway, slow, measured, pausing outside certain doors. When they check, there's no one there. Only the sound of someone exhaling softly through something thin and flexible like rubber. In the autumn of 1994, Hamburg was in the middle of one of its wettest seasons in decades. The rain fell in long, gray sheets that blurred the edges of the city. warehouse roofs glistening under streetlights, the Elbe swollen and brown, the alleys slick with oil and water. It was the kind of cold that seeped through gloves and coats, settling in the joints. Halloween was not a particularly German holiday then, but that year, the city's younger generation had started to embrace it. Bars in St. Pauli threw themed parties, and children went door to door in the newer suburbs, calling out Seuss's odor sores in awkward imitation of American movies. In the working-class neighborhood of Barmbek, 3 young people shared a flat above a bakery. Their names rarely appear together in the papers now. Privacy laws have changed, but at the time, they were known as Ank, Birgit, and Jonas, all in their early 20s. They worked part-time jobs, attended the local university, and were, according to friends, inseparable. On October 31st, they decided to host a small Halloween gathering. Nothing extravagant, just a few friends, candles, cheap decorations, and a borrowed cassette player that played 80s rock between rain squalls tapping the window. The guests began arriving around 8, coats dripping. Someone brought pumpkin soup. Another arrived in a vampire cape bought at a discount store near Hauptbahnhof. By 10, there were maybe a dozen people inside the small apartment, the air thick with cigarette smoke and warmth. Sometime after midnight, the rain turned heavier, and most guests left. Only the 3 roommates remained, along with a friend named Tilo, who offered to help clean up before walking home. They stacked plates, blew out candles, and talked quietly over the sound of wind. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. The following morning, the bakery owner came to open her shop and noticed water dripping from the ceiling. She assumed it was a burst pipe. When she went upstairs to check, she found the flat door unlocked. Inside, she smelled something metallic and sharp. The hallway light was still on. All 4 were dead. The scene was so strange that the first responding officers thought it was a prank gone wrong. The victims had been struck repeatedly with an axe. There are no signs of forced entry, no robbery, no sexual assault. Only one thing stood out. Each of the victims was wearing a mask. Paper, cheaply made, cut roughly into shapes. A skull, a jack-o'-lantern, a witch, and a blank white face. All of them had been tied in place after death with kitchen twine. The police sealed the building. The bakery closed. For days, investigators combed the apartment, photographing every surface. The neighbors heard nothing during the night, even though one wall shared with the flat was thin enough to transmit the sound of footsteps. When the autopsies were completed, the medical examiner estimated the time of death between 1 o'clock and 2:30 a.m. All victims had been asleep or subdued. There were no defensive wounds. The weapon was identified as a carpenter's axe, small, sharp, easily portable. The press named it the Hamburg Halloween Killings, and the story spread fast. Within days, reporters filled the narrow street. Cameras pointed toward the rain-streaked windows. Speculation replaced facts. A cult, a jealous ex, a random maniac. Police found none of it convincing. What they did find was a footprint. In the hallway near the front door, faint but clear enough to cast in plaster. A work boot, European size 44, partially smeared with something white. Later analysis revealed it to be gypsum powder, the kind used in renovation or mask making. That detail stuck. Detectives began searching local art schools and costume suppliers. They even visited theaters in Altena and Attensen, asking if any employee fit the description of a tall man who might have recently bought plaster or rope. No one came forward. Then, in early November, a janitor cleaning a storage unit beneath an abandoned textile factory near Hammerbrook found something odd, a wooden crate filled with masks. Dozens of them, some painted, others plain, each labeled with dates ranging from 1992 to 1994. A few resembled the ones found on the victims. The crate was traced to a man named Ernst Feld, 38, who had rented the unit for several years. He was a stagehand for a small performance troupe that specialized in experimental theater. When police questioned him, he appeared calm, even amused. He admitted to making masks, but denied any connection to the murders. "Half the city makes masks," he said. "It's Halloween." A search of his apartment yielded nothing. No weapons, no clothing with blood, no connection to the victims. But one photograph on his wall caught an investigator's attention. It showed 4 people in costume, standing on a dimly lit stage. 3 of them wore masks identical to the ones found in the flat. The 4th figure, partly obscured, stood at the edge of the frame, holding something long and metallic. The photo had no date, no names written on the back. Forensic experts analyzed the axe wounds again. The cuts were precise, deliberate, more controlled than impulsive. Whoever did it had experience with tools or anatomy. Feld, it turned out, had once worked as a set carpenter before joining the troupe. Still, there was no physical evidence to tie him to the killings. Without it, the case could not proceed. By December, the investigation had stalled. Feld disappeared soon after. His neighbors assumed he'd moved south, maybe to Munich or Vienna. He left no forwarding address, no relatives, no bank activity. The case grew cold. 2 years later, in 1996, a mask was discovered taped to the door of an abandoned cinema near St. Pauli. It was white, blank, with 2 small slits for eyes. On the inside, written in pencil, was a single phrase in German. Ich wollte nur sehen, wir sie wirklich sind. I just wanted to see who they really are. No fingerprints, no DNA. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and closely matched samples from Feld's rental forms. After that, nothing. The murders stopped, the flat was renovated, the bakery reopened. People forgot. Today, the official file still sits in the Hamburg archives, labeled Unresolved, Multiple Homicide, 1994. Inside are photographs of the scene. 4 masks laid neatly beside one another on a kitchen table, their edges stained, their expressions unreadable. The police never found the axe. And yet, according to one retired officer who worked the case, something strange happened a few years later. In 2002, he received a small parcel in the mail. Inside was a single photograph, the same one they'd taken from Feld's apartment years earlier. Only this time, the 4th figure was gone. The space where he'd been standing was empty.